Over the last couple months, I embarked on a complete overhaul of my Homelab setup, and the process was nothing short of intriguing. I ran into a plethora of problems, and today I'm going to kind of walk you through my journey with it so far. This isn't going to be a tutorial by any means, but I'm hoping that maybe some of you will get some insight out of what I've done, or at least find it somewhat entertaining. At the beginning, my server was really basic. I used an old laptop and I had Ubuntu server running on it. On that machine, I did all of my development. So anytime I wanted to code something or try something new, I tried it there. It was nice because it was an isolated environment and I didn't have to worry about installing things on various laptops and moving files around. It served me well up until recently when I started on a project in which I needed to use CUDA processing. So to use CUDA processing, you need an NVIDIA powered GPU, and unfortunately the laptop could not support me adding an additional GPU to it. So I decided that I was going to finally break down and build a dedicated server that I could actually run all my workloads on. Now, when I started building the server, I had a budget in mind. I didn't want to spend a whole lot of money, so I started by just repurposing a lot of the hardware I had from a previous desktop of mine because I had just recently replaced it. And then I filled in the bits and pieces that I needed with some cheap parts I found either on Amazon or on eBay. I found throughout this process, I actually was able to save a ton of money by using a lot of the hardware I already had. It wasn't bad hardware, it just was hardware that wasn't really being used for anything else, or really couldn't be used in top tier performance, but I didn't really need top tier performance for what I was looking for. So if you're looking to develop your own Homelab, I would say start with what you already have, or check your local listings on Facebook Marketplace and things. But speaking of older hardware, I actually have some leftover hard drives from a server that I have lying around. So I'm thinking about building a NAS and using that to help with some of my video editing workflows. So if that sounds like something that interests you, let me know down in the comments and I'll prioritize making that a video in the future. Now that I had the basis for my hardware figured out, I decided I was going to go down the route of using Proxmox. Proxmox will allow me to provision VMs and I won't have to worry about dealing with physical hardware after this initial setup. When I started this journey, I decided to create initially 3 VMs. 2 for a Kubernetes cluster, one being the worker node and one being the control node, and another being the development VM, and that is what's going to replace the old server that I did all my development on. And ultimately that will be the VM that uses the GPU for some of the CUDA processing things that I want to work on. When creating the VMs, I decided to start with the Kubernetes VMs first. This required me to create 2 VMs, one for the worker node and one for the control node. I decided that I wanted to run Kubernetes locally because I wanted to run some of the services that I had been running on the Linode K8s cluster. I wanted to run it locally so that way I wasn't paying for the subscription fees because I don't really need super powerful hardware anymore like what I was using on Linode services. To get the Kubernetes VMs up and running, I mainly followed the tutorial from Jay over at Learn Linux TV. I've linked his video down in the description. For the most part, I followed his directions. I changed a few things that were unique to my setup or just little things like that. But the bulk of it definitely came from him. So I would definitely check him out. He does a really good job in explaining everything and has a really good blog post linked as well that goes through the entire thing. The first real Homelab challenge came when I needed to install a load balancer so that way external traffic could get routed to the appropriate service in my Kubernetes cluster. You see, my current network setup did not allow for me to perform the advanced configurations I would need to route traffic to my Kubernetes load balancer. After much research, I realized that I needed a much better solution, and so I landed on this device. This is the Protectly Vault. I'm going to use it as a router by installing pfSense on it to control both my firewall and my routing for my entire network. The device itself really isn't special, but it does have 2 Ethernet ports, is fanless, and it also comes in a very small form factor. So it makes it actually a very good solution for a firewall device because it can pretty much be mounted anywhere in any sort of home lab or lab setup. And because of it being fanless, it's going to be very quiet, and that's really important considering it's going to be running, 24/7. I did run into a small hiccup. You see, my ISP's default fiber router that they install when they set up my internet service has a built-in firewall into it, and so it was causing some issues when I was trying to connect it up to the Protectly. However, after quite a bit of digging through the software settings, I did find that it has a pass-through feature. So once that was enabled, I was able to connect the Protectly Vault's WAN directly to the WAN port on my ISP's router box. From there, I was able to connect the LAN port of my Protectly to a gigabit switch that I already had in my existing network setup, so that way all the hardware devices on my network could have connectivity as well. Now, all of these configurations and setup that I might have mentioned might sound really simple, but I assure you they were not. Throughout this process, I had to reinstall the pfSense on that router about twice, and I ran into all sorts of issues between the ISP router, between my already existing network setup. So I'm not going to get into all the details here, but all in all, that took me about 4 days, and that did not include the initial setup of the Proxmox box and VMs. Anyway, now that I have my new router set up, I was able to turn my attention back to the K8s VMs. Remember, that's why we kind of fell down this whole rabbit hole of changing out and getting a new router anyway. I created a firewall rule to direct incoming traffic to my K8s cluster's load balancer. I also whitelisted a range of IPs so that way my Kubernetes cluster's load balancer could allot out IP addresses as it needs for services that are running within the cluster. After getting all that set up, I was able to reach any of the services that I had stood up in my cluster, so the routing rules and load balancer were working appropriately. Again, that might sound really simple. There definitely was a lot more to it, but if you're interested in kind of learning a little bit more about that, I've planned on potentially making a video about it because it was actually really interesting once I got everything working. So yeah, just let me know down in the comments if that's also something you kind of want to see. Now that I had the new router installed and the K8s VMs were set up and running correctly, I was able to move on to the next bit, which caused some issues. My wireless network kind of stopped working in the middle of all this network changes. At the time, I was using the Google Wi-Fi mesh network system, and it really is a great system, but the only problem is, as of the recording of this video, the network mesh required that the master node be connected directly to the WAN port that comes from your ISP's box. Now, in my former network setup, this wasn't a problem because I had the WAN from my ISP's box go directly to the WAN port of the Google Wi-Fi mesh network, and then I had the LAN port of that same node go into my gigabit switch, which then broke it out into everything else. However, now that the WAN port for the ISP box goes directly to the Protectly, and then the LAN from the Protectly goes into the network switch, I needed a mesh network that would allow me to just plug it into any arbitrary LAN and cycle that internet across wirelessly. So after a little bit of research and a little bit of digging, I landed on this Deco system from TP-Link. I learned from reading in some forums and stuff that other people that have Homelabs that were facing similar issues, like what I was facing with the Google Wi-Fi setup, had good success with this network. So I found a set on a really good deal and got them all set up. The setup was very similar and very comparable to the Google Wi-Fi setup. The only difference is they just use a different app. The worst part of the Wi-Fi change wasn't in the physical devices themselves. Those were very easy to set up. However, because my wireless network had now completely changed, I had to go through and manually reset and reconnect to the Wi-Fi network on every device in my home. You do not realize how many wireless devices you have in your home until you have to go through and you have to reset every single one. I'm talking everything from your home security system, to the smart bulbs, to your Google Wi-Fi network speakers. Everything had to be completely reset. And that is probably what took the longest out of any one task throughout this entire Homelab building experience. Additionally, looking back, I probably should have spent a little bit extra money on the wireless network and gotten the updated Deco points, because the updated Deco points supply a little bit more bandwidth over the network. However, I haven't really noticed any issues with our internet connectivity with this wireless system, but if for any reason I want to get faster speeds over my Wi-Fi, then I can always just replace them, and I shouldn't have to reset the whole network again so long as I just add individual nodes and take the old nodes off of the network. Now that I solved all of my networking issues, I was able to focus back in on why I started this whole project in the first place, and that was the creation of this development VM. Surprisingly enough, with Proxmox, it was a breeze to both create the development VM and use the PCI pass-through feature to allow the GPU to be passed directly to that particular VM. The real issue came into play when I was actually installing the CUDA software and drivers on the VM itself. Part of the problem is the software I was using wasn't using the most up-to-date version of CUDA, so when you're reading the NVIDIA documentation, it kind of took me a while to find the particular version I was using, and so actually installing that particular version. And it had all sorts of issues with dependencies and things like that. Again, it was quite a bit, but if you're interested, let me know down below and I'll make a video about it as well, because it's probably something that a lot of you are very interested in right now, with AI being such a popular topic right now. But it's really cool, and you definitely should try using CUDA processing if you're doing any sort of really advanced workloads, especially if you're doing anything that has to do with any sort of AI or machine learning sort of algorithms. Once I finally got CUDA drivers and everything installed, I was able to run all the workloads that I was looking to run, and they all ran very successfully, which I'm very happy about. And it really felt like everything was coming full circle on the project, and that was until I decided that I needed to run this application I built in a Kubernetes cluster so that way I could get greater availability. To run the workload in its own Kubernetes cluster, I decided just to stand up another machine. I know you're gonna wonder, well, why are you standing up another machine if you have these VMs? Well, unfortunately, the motherboard that's inside my Proxmox host now can't support 2 GPU cards. So in the future, I do want to migrate everything into one box, but for now, it was just cheaper and easier for me to set up a whole other machine. And to be honest, I've spent enough money and time on the project so far, and I just needed this to work for now. So I will definitely plan on upgrading that in the future, and I probably will make a more in-depth video of me actually covering the play-by-play of that migration, because I'm sure it's going to be really fun. Building my Homelab has proven to be a grueling but very rewarding task. I mean, I've taken a lot of these hardware things for granted, and it's really cool to see how it all works. Everything from the firewall, the physical firewalls and setting their rules, all the way to provisioning and setting up VMs on a hypervisor host. I hope you found my account today somewhat entertaining, maybe even helpful. If you did, make sure you like and comment down below so I know that you actually liked the video, and I can potentially make more videos like this as I do more things in my Homelab server. If you really liked anything I talked about today, or you're very curious about anything I talked about today, you want to see me make follow-up videos, whether it's about the CUDA processing or setting up a pfSense like network setup, please do let me know down in the comments down below, and I'll hopefully make a future video about it. But that's all I really got for you today. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next one. Bye.